Before the show, I wanted to relay a story I just learned. Recently, a man named John reached out to me on Instagram and let me know that he started to listen to this podcast, and it inspired him to pull out his old copy of Shoeless Joe, which, it turns out, is signed by W.P. Kinsella. And John actually purchased the book from Kinsella biographer Willie Steele years ago. Well, John just reached out to Steele and said he was going to be in the area near the university where Steele teaches. So the two are going to meet up and have a catch. And just saying this last sentence out loud, I have tears coming up. It's so amazing what's starting to happen, and I can't wait to see what else occurs. Thanks so much for sharing this story, John. Okay, here's tonight's episode. Sometimes we're walking down the street or hiking on a trail in the woods, and something off the path catches our eye. Sometimes the sight is so compelling that we have to divert. We have to step off the path to fully take in this mesmerizing attraction. Tonight in episode 4, we're stepping off the path of Field of Dreams and the novel Shoeless Joe because the attraction is just too amazing, too unbelievable to ignore. What is this attraction? A syndrome, more specifically, Eddie Scissons syndrome, which applies to men who lie about playing professional baseball. The term was first coined by author W.P. Kinsella in reference to one of his fictional characters in Shoeless Joe. The character, Eddie Scissons, is an old man who lied about playing Major League Baseball. Kinsella was so taken by this character and this idea that a few years later he wrote a short story titled The Eddie Scissons Syndrome. In the story, a student and a professor investigate and expose men lying about playing professional baseball. And here's where it gets weird, because around this same time, in real life, an actual student and an actual professor in Florida begin to investigate cases of the Eddie Scissons syndrome. And their real-life findings were nothing short of staggering. Tonight, Eddie Scissons and his syndrome. Life imitating art, imitating life.
This book really should have never been written. The film should have never been made.
I sort of have this feeling that one of the reasons I was born, was to be part of this, to get this out into the culture.
What they didn't count on was the word of mouth, that people would see it and then just say, oh my God, you have to go see this movie. It ended up defying the odds.
Midnight Library of Baseball presents Season 2, The Making of Field of Dreams. I'm Ben Orlando. As we saw in the previous episode, there are many key differences between the film Field of Dreams and the book Shoeless Joe. And one of the biggest is the character Eddie Scissons. Scissons didn't make the cut for the film, but he still ended up making history. In the novel Shoeless Joe, Ray Kinsella buys his farm from an 89-year-old man named Eddie Scissons. And Scissons claimed to have played with the famous infield trio of Tinkers, Evers, and Chance way back in the early 1900s. Ray eventually figures out that Eddie Scissons is lying, but he doesn't say anything. Then later in the story, while Eddie Salinger, Ray, and his family are watching the ghosts play, brother-in-law Mark comes up and outs Eddie Scissons. Mark says, quote, "He never played in the major leagues. Not only that, but he hardly played in the minors. And he's been passing himself off around here for 40 years as a Chicago Cub." End quote. After this announcement, Eddie Scissons is humiliated, and according to Ray, it's like watching an inflatable toy deflate after being stuck with pins over and over. Just to back up a little bit, this character, Eddie Scissons, is based on a real person. From Kinsella biographer Willie Steele.
Kinsella was in Iowa City, and this old man came up and asked what time it was or something. And then he, hey, I played for the Chicago Cubs. Well, when you say something like that to Bill Kinsella, he's thinking there's a story idea. Tell me about it. Well, I played with I think it was the 1908 Chicago Cubs, Tinker to Evers to Chance, I was like, oh, wow. So he gets the guy's name and was planning on going back to the retirement home where the man lived. And then he went to the Big Mac, the baseball encyclopedia, and he can't find this guy. Yeah. And so he realized, well, this is just an old man telling stories.
To clarify, the Big Mac that Willie Steele mentioned was a baseball encyclopedia that contained every man who ever played Major League Baseball. More on this later, but as Steele explained, W.P. Kinsella couldn't find the old man in the Big Mac. But that didn't stop his brain from asking, what if? And after this encounter, he decided to include a character like this old man in his first novel, Shoeless Joe. When we return to the novel, after Eddie Scissons is humiliated by Mark, the group is watching the ghost play baseball, and suddenly the game's announcer says through his distorted, haunting microphone, "Now in the game, Eddie Scissons." And out onto the mound trots this young man. It's similar to what happened with Archie Doc Graham, except here we have two Eddie Scissons at the same time. We have the old man in reality watching the game from the bleachers, and we have his younger version getting this opportunity to compete with these legendary major league players. For Archie Graham, things turned out relatively well. He got his at-bat, he got his hit, he played well. But for Eddie Scissons, it's a disaster. Again, from Willie Steele.
When he goes out and he sees himself just get shelled, right? They're just knocking him all over the field. And then one of my favorite lines is where they're sitting around the kitchen table later that night, and he says, "It takes more than an infinite ERA to shake my faith." And I'm like, I love that line. You watched what you thought would be your dream play out, and it's a nightmare. It says, but I still have faith.
Not only does young Eddie Scissons get shelled, but he freezes up on the field during key moments. This is a great turn in the story, because Eddie Scissons, he got what he always wanted, and it was excruciating. But he still faced it, and still, as Willie Steele explained, had faith in the game. And in the book, Eddie Scissons has his own speech, just like Salinger or James Earl Jones. And he sermonizes, really, about baseball. Quote, "Can you imagine walking around with the very word of baseball enshrined inside you? Because the word of salvation is baseball. It gets inside you, inside me, and the words that I speak are spirit, are baseball." End quote. And he goes on and on for paragraphs. So there is a sort of happy ending here, a happy turn, because even though he was exposed, even though Eddie Scissons sees his younger self and what would have happened, he still has faith. He's still able to face this reality and believe in the power of baseball. But author W.P. Kinsella doesn't let go of this idea of Eddie Scissons. A few years after Shoeless Joe, Kinsella ends up writing a short story called The Eddie Scissons Syndrome, which is part of a collection published in 1988 titled The Further Adventures of Slugger McBat. In the short story, a young ball player who blew out his knee becomes a research student, and he works with this professor studying the Eddie Scissons syndrome. And in this fictional story, the professor references the novel Shoeless Joe and the character Eddie Scissons. And this professor wants to do a study and find out how many baseball players lied about playing in the majors, just like Eddie Scissons did. He wants to talk to them and expose them, and he does. So that's mostly the story. But it's not the end of the story in real life. Around the same time Bill Kinsella was conjuring this fictional story of a student working with a professor to research the Eddie Scissons syndrome, a real-life student in Florida was working on his master's thesis when he began to encounter the Eddie Scissons syndrome. So he brought this to the attention of a friend of his who happened to be a professor, and the two decided to write a paper about real-life cases of the Eddie Scissons syndrome.
And I remember telling Dick about this in the mid-'80s. And he goes, boy, Robbie, you might have something here, Robbie. This sounds pretty interesting.
This is the real-life student.
My name's Rob Scheinkoff. So I worked in the admissions office when I worked with Dr. Crapeau here on this Eddie Scissons thing many years ago, 1989.
Yeah, I was looking at that today, that the short story that he wrote. I mean, he had a professor and a grad assistant as his two main characters who were pursuing the Eddie Scissons syndrome, which, you know, and he wasn't my grad assistant, but there were the two of us. And I was an academic and Rob wasn't.
This, of course, is the professor.
I'm Dick Crapeau. I'm now professor of history emeritus at the University of Central Florida in Orlando, where I taught for 44 years. And sport history was one of the courses I taught. I also had a course called The History and Literature of Baseball.
A few years before this fateful conversation between the two men, during the mid-'80s, Rob Scheinkoff began writing and researching a master's thesis about what Major League ball players did after they retired. In the 70s and 80s, players were not yet making the salaries they make today, so it was a valid question.
I did a master's thesis, and I discovered after interviewing 52 former Major League players that one of them was a fraud. One of them lied. The whole thing is a lie. I have 7 pages of my master's thesis that are built on this guy making everything up.
Scheinkoff had initially trusted this man, not yet aware of the Eddie Scissons syndrome. But when he learned the truth, it came as a major blow.
I felt like I was really set up. I approached this guy. I went up to him at halftime at a football game in the president's suite, and he was with his 10-year-old son. And I said, Greg, why did you lie to me? And he said, what are you talking about? I said, you never played for the Cleveland Indians. That's a lie. Why would you do that? He said, I don't know what you're talking about. And so I say to him, you know, you didn't play for them. The whole thing, 7 pages in my master's thesis, is built on a lie because of you. He said, I gotta go. And as he walked away, he stopped and he looked at me and said, Rob, give me a call next week. We'll talk about it. In other words, don't talk about it here in front of these people, especially my kid, because it's embarrassing.
Yeah, the other interesting thing about that guy is that he was a sponsor. He was a contributor to UCF baseball, the University of Central Florida baseball team, and his business had a sign on the outfield fence. And at one point, he threw out the first ball at I don't know if it was an opening day of a season or just a regular game, but he threw out a first pitch at a game at one time and was introduced as a former player for the Cleveland Indians.
And he followed up that, this is in my most recent paper, he followed up all of that hype by walking around signing autographs throughout the ballpark. People would come up, he's wearing that cheap Yahoo Indian that now is not allowed. He was wearing that hat, tipped it to people like, look at me, former Indian. And the whole thing is a lie.
But this wasn't the only encounter with a sufferer of Eddie Scissons syndrome. When Rob Scheinkoff worked in the admissions office, he signed up for one of Dick Crepeau's baseball history courses.
I ended up auditing, of course, because I couldn't keep up with the rigors. He assigned like 15 baseball books to be read in the first couple of weeks. And I said, I haven't read 15 books in my life.
During the class, Scheinkoff met a man who said he worked for a chiropractor who used to play for the New York Yankees.
And we looked at each other. This is after class. I said, what's his name? He goes, Hirschberger. And I said, what position? I'm a Yankee fan. I think I know most of the players. In what year? He goes, 1977, 78. What position? He said, third base. I said, did he used to go by the name of Greg Nettles? Is that like a name that he just picked up as he said, no, I said, okay, I need to meet him.
Rob Scheinkoff was on the case. He scheduled an appointment with the chiropractor and went to his office.
And I made it clear, I'm not here for an adjustment. My back is fine. And so I go in there, I said, I need 10 minutes of your time. And he said, well, the clock is ticking. I said, where do you get off? Passing yourself off as a former New York Yankee. And he holds out his hand. He's wearing a World Series ring. And he said, there you go. And I said, well, I don't care if you're wearing jewelry. You didn't play for the Yankees. I did my due diligence before I went there. And he got up and he said, I have nothing more to say. I said, no, you have plenty to say. You've been lying. So he sat down. He said, okay, I'll come clean. The reason I do this is because it helps in my business. If people think you played for the Yankees, then they're more prone to get, an adjustment with me. And I said, that is so I don't even know where to go with this. I mean, it's honest.
Yeah, but it made sense. At least it made sense, Rob.
He actually came clean and told me the truth.
Rob Scheinkoff and Dick Crepeau uncovered dozens of cases and wrote up their findings in a paper titled The Eddie Scissons Syndrome, Life Imitating Art, Imitating Life, which was published in the journal Athlon in 1991. The year before the publication, Scheinkoff and Crepeau presented their findings at the annual conference of the Sports Literature Association in Oregon in 1990, where, as fate would have it, W.P. Kinsella was also presenting. The three men ended up talking and sharing their different stories of Eddie Scissons syndrome sufferers. And when it came to sniffing out the rats, Rob Scheinkoff was no slouch. Before the internet, there was the Baseball Encyclopedia, dubbed the Big Mac, because it was published by Macmillan and Company. The Big Mac contained every Major League Baseball player from 1876 up to the latest edition of the book. If you were not in the book, you absolutely did not play Major League Baseball. And the Big Mac did not generalize. It included any person who stepped onto a Major League ball field for a Major League game for even 1 second.
Robin Yount's brother
Yeah.
is announced. He came out to throw a warm-up pitch and felt the pain in his shoulder. And so they had to take him out. So he never threw to a batter, but yet he's in the Big Mac because he was announced. He's in the game. And there are so many, obviously, Archibald Moonlight Graham, and then Millie Kennedy, our mutual friend. Her father came up to pinch hit, had a soft ground ball to second base on the second pitch that he faced. He's in the book. Afterwards, according to Millie, and you got to believe Millie, she's never lied in her life. The manager handed him the lineup card, which she has beautifully framed in her house, and said, "Hey, Kennedy, here's a souvenir. Now go out and get a real job." And he's in the book. He faced one batter. He pinch hit in the 8th inning for the St. Louis Browns, 1916. And that's it. And he's in the book.
When he worked in admissions at Central Florida University, Sheinkoff kept the Big Mac in his office, and on more than one occasion, he had reason to use it. A colleague or student would start telling a story, mention a father or uncle or grandparent, and Sheinkoff would walk over to the book and take a look. And almost always, he found no name in the Big Mac. What really surprised Crepeau and Sheinkoff was how many cases they came across.
The numbers, I mean, we just kept running into one story after another.
It makes more sense in an era before the internet, before cell phones, that men would try to get away with these lies. But even when technology was readily available, men still lied.
Most recently, the resurgence of this in the past couple of years, what surprised me was people didn't realize Google existed and you could easily track them down. That people think that by telling these stupid lies, there's no way to track them down. And that's what surprised me the most.
In the pursuit of men, always men, suffering from Eddie Scissons syndrome, there are certain signs to notice. For instance,
there was one guy I quoted, and he was a backup catcher to Johnny Bench. And I said, being a backup catcher is the most popular position for somebody suffering from Eddie Scissons syndrome, because who's going to check?
Also,
but a lot of these men of the cloth, people of the cloth, are the absolute worst. They are worst. They think they're going to be believed because they're wearing a collar. Come on.
And be on the lookout for fire.
The first guy we talked about, his house, all of his memorabilia disappeared in a fire.
It's tragic. It's tragic.
A lot of fires are involved in this stuff.
Yeah, all my uniforms, all my gloves, all my baseball, the pictures, the scrapbooks that my mother kept throughout the years.
The picture I had with Bob Feller.
Don't ask. It's a terrible thing that happened.
Finally, be wary of specificity.
People give too much detail. There was a guy who said he played for the Red Sox for 16 years. Nobody's ever heard of him. And he said, I set the record for most unassisted triple plays. I had 18 in my career. And it is the biggest lie ever told about baseball.
For the record, the total number of unassisted triple plays in Major League history, 15. And the most unassisted triple plays by one player, 1. If you like the show and crave more content, you can become a Patreon member, where you'll have access to additional audio episodes, video interviews, and other articles and images linked to the show. Go to Patreon/Midnight Library of Baseball. And since this is a one-man production, every bit of support helps. You can donate at midnightlibraryofbaseball.com, and you can add reviews on iTunes and Spotify. Okay, back to the show. One of the most powerful pieces of Sheinkoff's and Crepeau's research has to do with obituaries. When a father, grandfather, or uncle dies, the family often reaches out to the Baseball Hall of Fame to get some kind of written confirmation to verify what their deceased loved one claimed all his life. And according to Cooperstown researchers, 1 in 5 men who claim to have played major or minor league ball never did. 1 in 5. Rob Scheinkoff received a few of the responses to those letters from the Hall of Fame. Here's one. Quote, "Unless your father was playing and managing under another name, it would appear that the facts recited in the obituary cannot be substantiated. In our experience, about 1 out of 5 men who are said to have played Major League or Minor League Baseball did not do so. I do not intend any disrespect to your late father. However, before you invest any more time and money in research, I thought you should know that his baseball career, at least as stated in the obituary, did not take place." End quote. Recently, I spoke to one of the men who wrote those letters.
Hi, I'm Tim Wiles. I am a Chicago Cubs fan who went to college at the University of Iowa in the 1980s. Subsequently, I was able to become the reference librarian at the Baseball Hall of Fame, where I was from 1995 to 2014. I have written a couple of baseball books myself and a lot of articles, and then I believe that I am the all-time leader among those not related to W.P. Kinsella in driving him to and fro to airports. So I've done that 4 times, and he was an interesting fellow.
As Tim Wiles points out, baseball is one of the most well-documented sports and pastimes in American history.
Every major league player has a biographical clippings file at the Baseball Hall of Fame. And of course, all the minor league statistics are recorded. And these days, people can go and look on baseballreference.com. But Baseball Reference came along about halfway through my Hall of Fame career.
You know, in talking to Rob and Dick about the Eddie Scissons syndrome, and you worked in that area and received a lot of letters, obituaries, correct?
Yes, absolutely. Writing a letter and then later an email is a different medium, of course, than a face-to-face conversation. But you would try to do the saving face type thing. We actually had a form letter that said, thank you for contacting us about your relative who may have played professional baseball. Unfortunately, we can find no evidence that a person of that name ever played professional baseball. And I can't remember the exact wording, but I'm sure we tried to, again, cushion the blow. We would routinely, sometimes more than once a day, get men coming in with maybe a new wife or a new girlfriend and saying, yes, I played for, the Albuquerque Dukes in 1977. And so we would always try to, show them their stats, or if they were claiming to be a major league player, show them their clippings file and photo file and so forth. But of course, we also had a pretty good idea who hadn't really played. And sometimes they involved kids and grandkids, and Grandpa has always claimed to have played in the minors in the 1940s. And so you'd have to try to let them down easy, right in front of their family members and their descendants. It was just a little bit slightly uncomfortable for everybody.
As you may have guessed, while the Eddie Scissons syndrome specifically applies to baseball, there are many similar cases in other venues, for instance, politics and war. In their papers, Rob Scheinkoff and Dick Crapeau describe other cases of misremembering. Quote, "Former President Ronald Reagan very publicly recounted to a French diplomat his own personal experience on D-Day, storming the beaches of Normandy. I guess he didn't think any of the 30 or 40 reporters nearby, listening to every word he said, would fact-check that story. And Reagan also very publicly told the Israeli Prime Minister that he was heavily committed to Israel because he had personally taken part in the liberation of the death camps, and will never forget what he saw. It's no secret, and it's well documented, that Reagan never stormed the beaches of Normandy, never was personally involved in freeing the concentration camps, and he never set foot in Europe during World War II." End quote. and from their paper, a baseball war crossover. Quote, "You may recall several years ago, the Toronto Blue Jays manager admitted that for years he had been lying to the press and to his players about having served in Vietnam. He used fake combat stories to motivate his players, and apparently he felt it gave him added credibility with the press and with the fans." End quote. Tim Wiles is now retired from the Baseball Hall of Fame. Dick Crepeau still teaches and is now a professor of history emeritus at the University of Central Florida. And Rob Scheinkoff has continued to update the research and present his and Dick's findings at conferences across the country, including last year, the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. But Rob will never forget the conference in 1990, where he talked with and actually had a catch with Bill Kinsella.
The night of that dinner with Ken Kesey and that whole crowd, we went out and threw. And when we came back in, I said, "Would you sign this for me?" And he wrote, "Go the distance, Bill Kinsella." That ball was beat up. It was not a clean ball. I still have it. It's my prized. I have hundreds of autographed baseballs, usually by priests and nuns and colleagues at Marquette and some at Georgetown and what have you. But that ball means more to me than any memorabilia.
But to recap this whole crazy Eddie Scissons story, Bill Kinsella met a real man on the streets of Iowa who claimed to be an old-time baseball player. Kinsella opened his Big Mac reference book and quickly learned the truth. But his mind didn't stop there. The what-ifs continued to percolate until they turned into a character, and then a full-blown syndrome. As Tim Wiles put it,
That's how smart Kinsella, or how good Kinsella is, because I can tell you that, there were 1 or 2 or 3 people a day exhibiting this syndrome at the Hall of Fame's Research Center, but he experienced it apparently once and turned it into an intriguing sub-theme and subtext and so forth. And, like I had many summer interns and many colleagues over those years, men and women, and we mostly just chuckled about it, but I don't think it occurred to any of us to try to turn it into literary art.
We'll end tonight's episode with a Kinsella story from Hall of Fame librarian Tim Wiles.
I knew nothing about Kinsella in 1985 when I came to the University of Iowa, but during my first semester as an English major, I took a class called In Print in Person, and you would have 8 different writers for 2 weeks each over the 16-week semester, and one of those 8 writers was W.P. Kinsella. So he said something to me. I grew up in Peoria, Illinois, which is about 3 hours from Chicago and 3 hours from St. Louis. So we had 2 major league teams, but we always thought it was a huge production. Like if we got to go to a game, it would be maybe once a year. So I said to Kinsella in the class, you grew up in British Columbia, now you're here in Iowa, like all of the baseball teams are 5 or 6 hours away: Chicago, St. Louis, Kansas City, Milwaukee, Minnesota, and he said, hold on, like this is a matter of perspective. Like if you grew up in British Columbia when I did, like the nearest Major League Baseball team at one point was probably the St. Louis Cardinals. I don't know off the top of my head what year Kinsella was born, but he said, I feel like I'm in heaven because in less than 5 hours, I can be in all the cities you just named. On any given weekend, I can go see Major League Baseball, and I think it's great. Now, I was a young guy without a car, but his perspective that instead of Iowa City being out in the middle of nowhere, it was really conveniently located for 6 or 7 major league teams, kind of blew my mind. And I figured after reflecting on it that he was right.
In episode 5, we'll look at the meaningful, contentious relationship, both artistically and personally, between W.P. Kinsella and the author of The Catcher in the Rye, J.D. Salinger, without whom there would be no Shoeless Joe.
I thought, how would I feel if I was being reclusive and this happened to me? Am I invading this man's privacy? But my feeling is that he has always made himself conspicuous by hiding. I felt that really all I'm doing is giving him a little more publicity.
Next time, on Midnight Library Baseball presents The Making of Field of Dreams. The show is produced and edited by me, Ben Orlando. Music by Sergei Papkin and Ashot Danielyan. Good night.